in the hustle and bustle of today's world. Who among us doesn't yearn for a life filled with wealth and abundance? Not just material wealth, but a deep sense of inner peace and contentment. Yet, perhaps, there is one thing that most of us overlook. True wealth begins not with money, but with learning the path of the Dharma. For only when the heart is illuminated and the mind is trained, can riches truly last. Without this, wealth is like a passing cloud. It arrives and departs without leaving a trace. There is an old saying that goes, "Without the path of wisdom, money is wasted." Understanding the path, even with a little money, brings peace and joy. But it is not just in Buddhism or Zen teachings that we find this truth. Across cultures and spiritual paths, the wisdom of knowing when enough is considered far more valuable than the endless pursuit of more. Today, we will walk through several stories, each offering a quiet lesson about how true wealth does not come from accumulating possessions, but from understanding the deep value of life and recognizing that we are already rich. Though we may not always see it, these lessons come not only from ancient masters, but also from the simplest, most profound teachings of nature, stillness, and simplicity. Let's begin with an essential question. What is true wealth? Everyone has asked themselves at some point, how can I become truly wealthy? Some think of money, others think of power and fame. But when people achieve these goals, they often find themselves left with a deep emptiness, an unfulfilled sense of longing. As you sit in this peaceful space, take a deep breath. Let the noise of the world fade away. Consider this simple yet profound question. What is wealth, really? Wealth isn't just about abundance. It's about knowing when enough is enough. It's not just about gathering more outside, but about nurturing the inside. There are those who live in a small home, eating simple food, yet their hearts are at peace. They are truly wealthy. Then there are those who live in grand mansions, surrounded by wealth, but their hearts are restless. They are impoverished. A long time ago, a Zen master named Laozi taught a simple but profound truth. He who knows enough is rich. This wisdom tells us that the pursuit of wealth is not a constant race to gain more, but rather it is the art of knowing when to stop and how to appreciate what we already have. One day, in a small rural village, there lived a man named Uncle Tu, an elderly man in his 80s, who lived in a simple straw house beside a rice field. He had no children or relatives around him, only a small dog and a few rows of vegetables in his garden. His life was peaceful and quiet. With no ambition beyond the moments of tea he sipped in the mornings, reading old books and occasionally chatting with neighbors who passed by. One day, a young man named Tony from the city visited the village and heard stories about Uncle Tu's simple life. People said that Uncle Tu lived in poverty, so Tony decided to bring him a gift of some new clothes and, if possible, assist him with some financial help. As he sat down with Uncle Tu in the humble home, Tony noticed the few old, worn-out possessions that the elder had, especially a teacup that seemed very old, chipped but well-loved. Feeling uncomfortable, Tony said, "Uncle, the cup seems old and worn. let me buy you a new one." Uncle Tu smiled gently, lifting the cup in his hands. "This cup has been with me for over 20 years. It may be chipped, but it still carries the fragrance of the tea. It has been my companion each morning. I have no need for a new one. I have everything I need." Tony was surprised. "But it's broken. Surely it's time for a new one." Uncle Tu laughed quietly. "The cup may be chipped, but my heart is content. When we learn to find enough in what we already have, we realize how rich we truly are." Tony sat in silence, contemplating the wisdom in Uncle Tu's words. The old man's smile was warm, and there was a peaceful glow in his eyes. Tony noticed how content Uncle Tu was, living alone in his modest house, yet not feeling lonely or lacking anything. He was rich in his simplicity. That evening, Tony returned to the city, carrying with him something far more valuable than a new teacup. He carried the realization that true wealth is not about what one possesses, but about what one knows to appreciate. It's about finding contentment in the present moment, embracing the beauty of simplicity, and cultivating peace within. Years later, Tony would remember Uncle Tu's wisdom whenever he faced difficult decisions. The peace that had settled in his heart that day was like the tea he had shared with the old man, gentle, steady, and warm. The story of the teacup shows us that wealth does not lie in the accumulation of material things, but in the recognition of how much we already have. When we understand the value of simplicity, contentment, and gratitude, we realize that we are already rich in ways we cannot always measure with money. In the days that followed, Tony's life became simpler. He began to find contentment in what he already had. He learned to stop chasing endless desires and instead focused on appreciating the quiet moments, those simple, everyday treasures that often go unnoticed. The wisdom of Uncle Tu stayed with him for the rest of his life, reminding him that true wealth, the kind that doesn't fade or slip through our fingers, comes from within. When the heart is rich in peace, the world becomes abundant in its own way. There is no need to seek out more when the heart has found enough. After Tony's encounter with Uncle Tu, he often reflected on the teachings of that simple yet profound conversation. It became clear to him that the world, in all its complexity and noise, often drowned out the very essence of what he sought: most peace, simplicity, and contentment. The notion that wealth was not about accumulating but about appreciating struck him deeply. Yet, living in a society that placed so much value on material success, Tony began to feel the tension between what he now understood and the world around him. As he sat at his desk in his modern apartment, scrolling through endless feeds of social media, Tony couldn't help but notice how much of the world seemed to revolve around the pursuit of more. The latest gadgets, the newest cars, the most luxurious vacations, everything screamed that more was better. And yet, in his quiet moments, Tony realized that the pursuit of more had led him to not less material wealth, but less peace, less happiness, less fulfillment. One evening, feeling the weight of this internal conflict, Tony decided to return to the village. He yearned to seek the tranquility that Uncle Tu had mastered. He packed a small bag and drove out of the city, eager to reconnect with the peaceful rhythms of nature that he had so long overlooked. As he approached the small village, he felt the familiar calm of the countryside begin to settle into his chest. Uncle Tu was in his garden, tending to the vegetables as he always did. His dog, a small, scruffy creature, was chasing butterflies nearby. The moment Tony stepped onto the dirt path leading to the house, Uncle Tu looked up and smiled warmly. "It's been a while," the old man said, his voice gentle as ever. "Come, sit with me. The tea is ready." Tony took a seat next to him, feeling an odd sense of relief wash over him. The simplicity of the moment, the quiet of the evening, the sound of birds in the trees, the fresh earth beneath his feet felt like a balm to his overstimulated mind. As they sipped tea, Tony said, "Uncle Tu, I've been struggling. I can't seem to reconcile what I've learned from you with the world I live in. Everyone is so focused on gaining more, but I don't know if I want any of it anymore. I feel caught between two worlds, one that tells me more is always better, and another that tells me enough is already enough." Uncle Tu nodded, a knowing smile playing at the corners of his mouth. That is the dilemma of every person who seeks peace. You are not alone in feeling this way. The world will always push you to want more, to strive for things that are temporary. But the path of peace lies in understanding that true fulfillment is found within. Tony listened intently, his heart swelling with a sense of recognition. The words felt like a familiar echo, but it was the first time he truly understood them. Uncle Tu continued, "You see, Tony, life is like this garden. When you plant a seed, you do not dig it up every day to see how it's growing. You trust that, in time, it will flourish. You water it, give it sunlight, and wait. You must do the same for your heart. Plant it with seeds of peace, gratitude, and contentment. Let them grow in their own time." Tony looked down at the garden surrounding them. It was modest, but the earth was rich, the plants healthy, and everything seemed to work in harmony. He had spent so much of his life trying to speed up the process, rushing to acquire more, achieve more, do more, but it had only left him feeling exhausted and empty. "Uncle Tu, what if I'm afraid that if I stop chasing after more, I'll be left behind?" Tony asked, his voice filled with uncertainty. "The world doesn't seem to stop pushing forward. Everyone is moving so fast, and I feel like I'll miss out if I don't keep up." The old man's eyes softened. "The world will always move, Tony. It will never stop. But that is the illusion. The truth is that time moves at its own pace, and so must we. If you keep chasing after everything, you will miss the present moment, and in doing so, you will never truly live. Living is about being present, being in harmony with what is now, not what could be or what once was." Tony's mind was quiet as the old man's words settled deep into his heart. He felt a new clarity rising within him, like the calm after a storm. For the first time in a long while, Tony understood. It wasn't about choosing between one world or the other. It was about finding balance. It was about living authentically, not based on the expectations or pressures of others, but grounded in what truly brought peace to his heart. That evening, as the sun set and the sky turned a soft shade of orange, Tony felt something inside him shift. He didn't need to change the world around him to feel whole. He only needed to change how he saw it. As Tony stayed in the village for the next few days, he embraced the simplicity of each moment. He worked in Uncle Too's garden, sat quietly with the old man, and immersed himself in the rhythms of the natural world. His mind, once cluttered with worries and distractions, began to quiet. He began to understand the value of stillness, the deep well of wisdom that comes from being present and allowing life to unfold naturally. On the final evening before he left, Tony sat with Uncle Too by the garden. The old man handed him the familiar, chipped teacup. "You must take this with you," Uncle Too said. "Let it remind you that simplicity is the key to peace. You are never without enough when you have peace in your heart." Tony nodded, holding the cup gently in his hands. He had never felt more connected to himself, to the world around him, and to the wisdom that had always been right in front of him. As he left the village, he knew that his journey had only just begun. As Tony drove back to the city, the noise of the world seemed to press in on him from all sides. The blaring horns, the bustling streets, the endless rush of people chasing their ambitions, it was all so overwhelming. But something within him had shifted. He had learned that peace didn't come from the absence of noise, but from how you responded to it. It was about finding a quiet space within, no matter how loud the world around you became. When he arrived back at his apartment, Tony felt a strange sense of detachment. The sleek furniture, the polished surfaces, and the endless stream of emails all seemed to fade into the background. He had once believed that these things were necessary to feel complete, but now they seemed less significant. They were just objects, tools in a game that he no longer wished to play. He sat on his couch, staring out of the window at the sprawling city below. The city was alive, constantly moving, always demanding more from its inhabitants. But for the first time in his life, Tony didn't feel compelled to chase after it. Instead, he felt like an observer, watching the rush of life without the need to participate in its frantic pace. The next morning, Tony made a decision. He would no longer spend his days running on autopilot, simply following the expectations of society. He would seek out work that aligned with his values, that allowed him to create a life of simplicity and purpose. The job he had in the corporate world no longer satisfied him. It was filled with deadlines, pressure, and a relentless pursuit of profit. It was a world of constant motion, but it lacked meaning. Tony knew he couldn't continue living this way. He needed to make a change, to step away from the noise and find a path that resonated with the quiet truths he had discovered in the village. But what would that path look like? He wasn't sure yet, but he knew he had to trust in the process. The first step was to have a conversation with his boss, a man who epitomized the world of corporate ambition. Mr. Hai was tall, sharply dressed, and always on the move, as if his very presence demanded action. He had always seen Tony as an ambitious, rising star in the company, someone who would go far if he continued to push himself. Tony had always lived up to those expectations, but now, as he sat in the meeting room, he realized that the ambition he had once embraced had no longer brought him joy. It had only caused him stress, exhaustion, and a sense of emptiness. "Mr. Hai," Tony began, his voice steady but resolute. I've been reflecting a lot lately about my future, and I've come to realize that I need a change. I want to step away from the corporate world. Mr. Hai's expression remained unchanged, but Tony could see the surprise flicker in his eyes. Tony, this is unexpected. You're one of our brightest. Why would you want to leave now? At the height of your career, Tony took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his decision, but also the clarity that came with it. I have learned that success doesn't mean the same thing to me anymore. I need to pursue something that brings me peace, something that aligns with my values. I want to create work that contributes to the world in a meaningful way. Mr. Hai leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. I see. And what exactly do you plan to do? You've built a career here. Tony, are you willing to walk away from all of that? Tony met his boss's gaze and nodded. Yes, it's time for me to find my own path. The silence between them stretched on for a moment. Finally, Mr. Hai spoke, his voice softer than usual. I understand, and I wish you the best. Tony, if you ever want to return, the door is always open. As Tony left the office that day, he felt a sense of lightness wash over him. It was a decision that had been years in the making, but it felt right. For the first time in a long time, he felt free. The future was uncertain, but it was his to shape. That afternoon, Tony went to the park to clear his mind. He found a quiet spot near a pond, surrounded by trees that rustled in the breeze. He sat down on a bench, closing his eyes for a moment and taking a deep breath. He felt the sun on his face and the soft wind on his skin. It was a moment of stillness, a moment of peace. As he sat there, he began to think about what he wanted to do next. He didn't have all the answers yet, but he knew that his journey was just beginning. He was no longer chasing after something outside of himself. He was learning to live for the present, to savor the moments as they came, without the need for constant striving. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of reflection and planning. Tony took some time off to travel, seeking new experiences and perspectives. He visited small villages, immersed himself in nature, and spent time with people who shared his values. He read books on mindfulness, spirituality, and personal growth. It wasn't about finding answers. It was about embracing the questions and allowing the answers to come naturally and slowly. The path began to reveal itself. Tony started to focus on work that brought him closer to his true self, work that allowed him to create, to share, and to give back. He began writing a blog about the lessons he had learned, the importance of peace, and the power of simplicity. His writing resonated with others who, like him, were seeking a deeper, more meaningful life. As the months passed, Tony found himself more grounded, more connected to the present moment. The world around him still moved at its frenetic pace, but he no longer felt the need to chase after it. He had found a quiet peace within himself, and that was all he needed. Tony's journey was far from over. There were still challenges to face, still lessons to learn, but he now walked with a quiet confidence, knowing that the path he had chosen was one of authenticity, simplicity, and peace. Tony's life settled into a new rhythm. It was a rhythm built not on deadlines and corporate goals, but on intention and presence. The days flowed in a way that felt natural, as if they were unfolding in perfect harmony with the world around him. He didn't force anything, he simply allowed things to come to him. And yet, as he lived this new life, a sense of fulfillment that had always eluded him began to take root deep inside. He continued to write, sharing his experiences and insights on his blog. At first, the audience was small, just a handful of people who stumbled across his posts. But over time, his words began to resonate with more and more people. They were hungry for the same peace he had found, the same stillness in a world that seemed determined to keep moving at a frantic pace. One evening, after finishing a post on mindfulness, Tony received an email from a reader. The subject line caught his eye. "Your words have changed my life." Curious, he opened it. The email came from Min, a woman in her early 30s who lived in the bustling city of Hanoi. She had come across his blog during a difficult time in her life, and the post on finding peace amidst chaos had struck a chord. Min wrote about how she had been caught in the whirlwind of work, family expectations, and personal doubt. She felt as though she was constantly running, never finding time to simply be. Tony's heart warmed as he read her words. She spoke of her struggles to balance her career with her desire to live a more peaceful, purposeful life. But the most touching part of the email was her closing line. "I never thought I could live without constantly feeling like I was failing. But after reading your posts, I see there's another way, a way to live in peace with myself." Min's email was a revelation. Tony had often wondered if his words could make a difference, if anyone was truly listening, but here was the proof that they did. His journey wasn't just for himself, it had the potential to help others, to inspire them to seek their own path to peace. It was a humbling realization, and one that made him even more committed to his new way of living. The next morning, Tony sat at his desk, reflecting on what had just happened. Min wasn't the only one who needed guidance. There were millions of people who felt lost in the noise of modern life. People who were yearning for something deeper, something real. He began to think about ways he could reach more people, to share the message of peace and simplicity on a larger scale. That afternoon, he sat down with a pen and paper, brainstorming ideas for a book that would delve deeper into the principles of mindful living, how to detach from the chaos, and how to find a sense of purpose in a world that constantly demanded more. It wasn't an easy decision. Writing a book was a big undertaking, and Tony wasn't sure he was ready for such a commitment. But the thought of sharing his journey with others, of reaching out to those who needed it most, felt like the next step in his evolution. He had a story to tell, and it was time to share it. Over the next several months, Tony threw himself into his writing. He worked long hours, some days losing track of time as the words flowed onto the page. He wrote about his own experiences, his time in the village, his struggles with ambition, and the lessons he had learned about the power of presence and simplicity. But he also researched, read books on mindfulness and spirituality, and sought out other perspectives to enrich his own understanding. The process was both difficult and exhilarating. There were moments when doubt crept in, when Tony questioned whether anyone would care about what he had to say. But each time, he reminded himself that this book wasn't about achieving success or recognition. It was about sharing the truth he had discovered, the truth that peace, purpose, and fulfillment didn't come from external achievements, but from within. When he finally completed the manuscript, Tony felt a profound sense of accomplishment. It wasn't just the completion of a book, it was the culmination of a journey that had started years ago. When he first began to question the life he was living, he had walked away from the corporate world, left behind his old ambitions, and embarked on a path that was truly his own. Now, with his book in hand, Tony was ready to share it with the world. A few months later, after much deliberation and with the help of a small publishing company, Tony's book was released. It was titled The Quiet Path: Finding Peace in a Noisy World. The book was a reflection of everything Tony had learned and experienced. It wasn't a guide or a how-to book. It was a deeply personal exploration of how to find balance and stillness amidst the chaos of modern life. The response was overwhelming. People from all over the world began to reach out to Tony, sharing their stories of how his book had touched them. They spoke of how it had inspired them to make changes in their own lives, to step away from the rat race and reconnect with what truly mattered. Tony was humbled and grateful. But more than anything, he felt that familiar sense of peace that had led him on this journey in the first place. As he sat back in his apartment one evening, the sounds of the city drifting up from below, Tony reflected on how far he had come. He had found a life that was not defined by the external markers of success, but by the inner peace he had cultivated. His days were no longer filled with the frenetic energy of the corporate world. Instead, they were filled with purpose, simplicity, and a quiet joy that came from living in alignment with his values. Tony had discovered that true fulfillment came not from achieving more, but from learning to embrace the present moment, to listen to the stillness within, and to trust that the journey was exactly as it was meant to be. The success of The Quiet Path brought Tony more than just recognition. It also introduced him to a new community of like-minded individuals, all of whom were on their own journeys toward peace and fulfillment. In many ways, it felt like the beginning of something even greater. Tony had begun with a desire to understand himself, but now his message was resonating with thousands of people who were also searching for meaning in their own lives. One day, as Tony was working in his quiet office, he received an unexpected phone call. The voice on the other end was warm and welcoming. "Hello, is this Tony? My name is Mai, and I'm a producer for a radio station in Hanoi. I've read your book, and I'd love to invite you onto our show to talk about mindfulness and the importance of slowing down in our modern, fast-paced world." Tony had always been a bit hesitant about public speaking. The thought of being on the radio, sharing his journey with an audience, made him nervous. But there was something about Mai's voice, something about the opportunity to reach more people with his message, that made him reconsider. After a moment of contemplation, he agreed. The following week, Tony found himself sitting in a small, professional studio, the microphone in front of him, feeling both foreign and familiar. Mai welcomed him with a smile and a gentle handshake. The conversation began with small talk, but soon they were diving deep into the core of what Tony had learned over the years. The interview was a success. Tony spoke about his book, about the importance of mindfulness, and about his belief that true fulfillment could only be found when one let go of the need for constant achievement. He shared stories from his own life, explaining how his shift in perspective had helped him find peace in a world that often seemed chaotic. When the interview aired, it was met with an overwhelming response. Listeners sent in messages and emails, thanking Tony for sharing his story and for offering them hope. He realized that his journey had become something much larger than himself. It was now a movement of people who were tired of living in the shadows of their ambitions and who were ready to embrace a quieter, more intentional life. Tony received invitations to speak at events, to lead workshops on mindfulness, and to connect with communities that were eager to learn more. But even as his external world grew busier, his inner world remained grounded. He had learned the art of balance, the ability to engage with the world without being swept away by it. As he navigated this new chapter in his life, Tony felt a deep sense of gratitude for everything he had experienced. There were still challenges, of course, moments of doubt and fear, times when the demands of the outside world threatened to pull him back into the frantic pace of his former life. But these moments were becoming less frequent, and he knew how to handle them now. He simply returned to the principles he had written about in his book. Stay present, stay grounded, and trust the process. One evening, after returning from a particularly busy event, Tony sat on his balcony, gazing out at the city below. The sun had just set, painting the sky in shades of purple and orange. For the first time in a long while, he felt at peace. It was a peace that didn't come from external circumstances, but from within. As he closed his eyes and took a deep breath, Tony thought about how far he had come. He thought about the man he used to be, driven by ambition, constantly striving for success, and compared him to the man he was now. The shift had been subtle, yet profound. It wasn't about giving up his goals or ambitions, but about redefining them. His true goal now was to live a life of meaning, to be present in every moment, and to help others find their own path to peace. He smiled to himself, knowing that this journey was far from over. There were still lessons to learn, still people to meet, still moments of growth to experience. But for the first time, Tony was no longer chasing anything. He was simply living with a heart full of gratitude and a spirit at peace. And as the stars began to appear in the night sky, Tony knew that he had found something more valuable than any success or recognition. He had found a contentment. His journey was not about achieving more, but about embracing the stillness, the quiet moments, and the simple joys of life. It was about living in alignment with his values and trusting that, in doing so, everything else would fall into place. The future felt bright, not because of what he had accomplished, but because of the person he was becoming. Tony had found peace, and it was enough. Tony's newfound life was no longer about the hustle. He had stepped off the treadmill of success and ambition, and though it was a relief, there were moments of uncertainty. He had left behind a life where every day was a race to accomplish more, to climb higher, to prove something to the world. Now, he was living on his own terms, but sometimes it felt like the world was moving without him. It was a strange feeling, freedom, mixed with a slight sense of disconnection. At first, it was hard to shake off the old patterns of constantly needing to do. He had been conditioned to believe that only through achievement could he measure his worth. But over time, the simplicity of his current life began to feel natural. He wasn't rushing anymore. He was more present, more engaged with the little moments, like the feeling of the warm sun on his face as he walked through the streets of Hanoi, or the joy of a cup of tea brewed just right. These small moments began to carry more weight than the monumental achievements that had once defined him. One afternoon, as he was preparing for another book signing event in a small bookstore, Tony received a message that caught him off guard. It was from Mai, the radio producer who had first introduced him to a larger audience. "Hey Tony, I hope you're well. I've been thinking a lot about our conversation last time. There's something I want to share with you. I'm starting a new project focused on mental health awareness, and I believe your story could be an inspiration to a lot of people. I would love to have you involved, if you're open to it." The message stirred something inside him. Mental health was a topic close to Tony's heart. It was what had ultimately led him down this path of mindfulness and inner peace. He had often thought about how the pressures of modern life had caused so many people to lose touch with themselves, with their emotions. Now, here was an opportunity to speak directly to people who were struggling, to offer them a glimpse of the peace he had found. It felt like the right thing to do. Tony replied with a quick yes. He felt a surge of energy and purpose, the kind he hadn't felt in a while. It wasn't about success or accolades anymore. It was about being of service. For years, he had been driven by the need to be seen and heard. But now, he realized that his voice could make a difference in someone else's life. It was the shift he had been waiting for. The mental health project was an eye-opening experience. Mai had gathered a diverse group of people, all of whom had their own struggles with mental health. Tony was moved by their stories. As he listened to them share their experiences of anxiety, depression, and burnout, he felt a deep connection with them. It was as though their struggles mirrored his own from just a few years ago. The difference was that now he had found tools to navigate the chaos, tools like mindfulness, meditation, and the simple act of slowing down. He realized that while everyone's journey was different, they all had the potential to find peace within themselves. Over the next few months, Tony found himself increasingly involved in the project. He was invited to speak at workshops, to share his story in person, and to mentor others who were struggling. It was fulfilling in ways he hadn't anticipated. He saw people who had once been overwhelmed by their emotions begin to find clarity. He witnessed people who felt lost find a sense of direction. It was a humbling experience, one that made Tony even more committed to the path he had chosen. In the quiet of his evenings, Tony would reflect on how far he had come. He thought back to his old life, the one filled with deadlines, meetings, and the constant pressure to achieve. It felt like a lifetime ago. Now, he woke up each morning with a sense of calm, with no agenda other than to live in the moment. One evening, after a particularly long day of workshops and speaking engagements, Tony sat down in a small apartment, his feet tired but his heart full. He looked out of the window at the city below, watching as the lights flickered in the distance. The world was still moving at its usual pace, but he had found his rhythm in it. His phone buzzed. It was a message from Mai again. Just wanted to say thank you for everything you've done for the project. Your words have made such a difference in so many lives. I know this is only the beginning. Tony smiled as he read the message. The old him would have been looking for a way to measure the success of the project. How many people attended, how much recognition it brought him. But now, he didn't care about any of that. What mattered to him was knowing that he had touched lives, that he had helped people who needed it. That, to him, was success. The next morning, Tony woke up and went through his usual morning routine meditation. A simple breakfast, a walk through the city. He felt grounded, centered, as if his life was unfolding exactly as it was meant to. There were no grand ambitions anymore, no desire to climb the corporate ladder or achieve more accolades. All that mattered was living authentically, helping others, and staying true to the lessons he had learned. And in this quiet, meaningful existence, Tony realized that he had already found what he had once been searching for: peace, fulfillment, purpose. He didn't need to keep running. He was finally home. The days continued to blend together, each one a quiet affirmation of Tony's new life. As the months passed, the city around him changed. New buildings sprang up, old cafes closed, and the rhythm of life continued, unchanged and yet always shifting. But within Tony, the changes were more profound. He was no longer a man at war with his own ambition. He no longer had to chase something. He had found peace, not in the things he could collect or the milestones he could reach, but in the simplicity of being. Yet, even amidst this calm, there were moments of doubt. He couldn't help but wonder if he was doing enough. There were days when he felt the pull of his old self, the one who thrived on achievement, recognition, and the pursuit of success. Those urges still came up now and then, but Tony had learned to let them pass without grasping onto them. Instead of resisting them, he allowed them to drift through his mind like clouds. He had realized that doubt didn't have to be feared. It could simply be acknowledged and then released. One of the most profound shifts in Tony's life was his relationship with time. In his old life, time had always been an enemy. He had always felt like there wasn't enough of it, like it was slipping away, like he was running out of time to make his mark. But now, he approached time with a sense of patience. He didn't measure his days in accomplishments or milestones. Instead, he measured them in moments, moments of stillness, moments of connection, moments of growth. This mindset was especially clear in his continued work with Mai's mental health project. Tony had become a mentor to several young people who were struggling with various issues: stress, anxiety, depression, and burnout. They came from all walks of life, but they shared one thing in common. They were overwhelmed The pressures of modern life had left them feeling unmoored, uncertain, and exhausted. Tony had been there. He understood what they were going through, but now he could offer them the tools to navigate through it. The workshops were some of the most rewarding parts of his week. He taught his mentees the value of slowing down, of being present in their own lives. He showed them how to embrace their emotions without being consumed by them. He encouraged them to seek peace, not in the external world, but within themselves. And over time, he saw them change. He saw them begin to take control of their own mental health, to find moments of calm in the midst of chaos. It was a quiet revolution, one that didn't require grand gestures or loud proclamations, but one that was far more meaningful. One day, after a particularly emotional session with one of his mentees, Tony found himself walking through the park. Deep in thought, his mentee had shared how she had struggled for years with imposter syndrome, how she always felt like she wasn't good enough, no matter how much she accomplished. Tony had listened, nodding in understanding, but the conversation had left him with a lingering thought. Was he enough? He had let go of his need for success, but was it enough to simply be? His phone buzzed, snapping him out of his reverie. It was Tony. We've been invited to speak at a major conference on mental health next month. It's a huge opportunity for the project, and I'd love for you to be part of it. What do you think? The message surprised him. He had been so caught up in his new routine, his new sense of purpose, that he hadn't thought about the bigger picture. He hadn't thought about scaling the project, about taking it to the next level. But here it was, an opportunity to reach more people, to share his message on a much larger stage. His initial reaction was hesitation. The idea of being thrust into the spotlight again felt uncomfortable. He had found his peace in the quiet, in the personal connections he had made through smaller, intimate workshops. The thought of returning to the spotlight, of speaking in front of hundreds of people, of answering questions, of being scrutinized, felt like a return to the old life he had worked so hard to leave behind. But then he remembered what had brought him here, the desire to help, to give back, to share the lessons he had learned. He remembered the faces of the people he had worked with, the ones who had shared their struggles and found a bit of peace in their journey. He remembered the power of his own story and how it had inspired others to start their own journeys toward healing. It wasn't about fame or recognition. It wasn't about achieving something for the sake of achievement. It was about reaching people, about making a difference. And if this conference would allow him to do that, then he had to say yes. Tony typed his response to I'm in. Over the next few weeks, the project gained momentum. The conference loomed on the horizon, and Tony threw himself into preparation. He worked closely with Mai and the team, crafting their message, refining their approach. He even reached out to some of his old contacts in the medias, sharing his story and the work they were doing. Slowly but surely, the project gained traction. People began to take notice. The day of the conference arrived, and Tony found himself backstage, preparing to speak in front of a crowd of hundreds. The nerves were there, as they always were before a big moment. But this time, he wasn't afraid. He wasn't focused on how he would be perceived or how well he would perform. He was focused on the message. He was focused on the people in the room who were struggling, who needed to hear that they weren't alone. When he stepped onto the stage, the spotlight felt warm rather than harsh. The audience seemed to fade away as he found his rhythm, speaking from the heart about his journey, about the lessons he had learned, and about the power of slowing down. He shared the tools that had helped him find peace, the ones that he now passed on to others. And as he spoke, he felt the connection to the audience, the shared understanding, the quiet power of being vulnerable and real. After the speech, there was an overwhelming sense of gratitude, not just from the audience, but from Tony himself. He had spoken his truth, and in doing so, he had opened up a space for others to do the same. That night, as he lay in bed, he realized that his journey wasn't about achieving success in the traditional sense. It was about sharing his story, about being authentic, about helping others along the way. It was about finding peace in the midst of the chaos and learning that success wasn't something to chase, it was something to experience. In every quiet moment, in every shared connection, and in that moment, Tony understood he was enough. The conference had been a turning point, a reaffirmation that Tony's path was not only possible but necessary. As the days that followed settled into routine, the ripples from his speech continued to echo. Messages poured in from people who had heard his talk, thanking him for his honesty, for showing them that peace didn't require perfection, that it was okay to be vulnerable. Tony had always known that the journey to peace was personal, but now he was witnessing the shared impact of it, and it was a powerful reminder that even the smallest acts of courage could resonate far beyond what one might imagine. For the first time in a long while, Tony allowed himself to rest, to take a step back. He'd spent so many years driving himself forward, and now, in this moment of reflection, he realized how much he had neglected his own needs. He had given so much of himself to his work, to the people he helped, to the project he was so passionate about, and while he was proud of all of it, he had ignored the need to nurture the parts of himself that still carried the weight of his past. It was time to take a break, to reconnect with the aspects of life that he had pushed aside. His apartment, once filled with only the remnants of past achievements, now felt like a sanctuary. The quiet of the evenings, the soft lighting, and the books that lined his shelves, it all welcomed him home in a way he had long forgotten. Mai, sensing his need for rest, encouraged him to take a few days off. "You've earned it," she said one afternoon as they sat together in the office. "You've done so much for this project, for everyone else. Now it's time for you to remember what it feels like to take care of yourself." Tony smiled, his eyes softening with gratitude. Mai had become more than just a colleague. She was a friend, someone who had stood by him through every twist and turn of this journey. Her unwavering belief in him had been a constant anchor, a reminder that even in his lowest moments, he wasn't alone. As he took his break, Tony returned to the simple joys that had once nourished his spirit. He began to spend more time outdoors, walking through the parks and sitting by the lake, allowing the quiet beauty of nature to fill his senses. He visited old friends, reconnecting with people who had been a part of his life before the weight of ambition had consumed him. These were the moments that reminded him of the richness of life beyond success, beyond achievement. During one of his walks in the park, Tony crossed paths with an old acquaintance, a fellow from his earlier career days, and had been one of the people Tony had once competed with for promotions, for recognition, someone who had always been a reminder of the race Tony had been running. They stopped and chatted for a few minutes, catching up on their lives, and asked him what he was up to these days. And Tony, for the first time in a long time, was able to answer without hesitation. "I'm helping others," Tony said simply. "I've been focusing on mental health, teaching people how to slow down and be present. It's been life-changing," and raised an eyebrow. "That's a far cry from what you were doing before," he commented with a laugh. Tony nodded. The weight of the years he had spent in the fast-paced corporate world now seeming like a distant memory. "I used to think success was about climbing the ladder, about doing more, about achieving more, but I was wrong. It's about being. It's about knowing what you value and making peace with that." Anne paused, considering Tony's words. "I think I get it," he said quietly. "I've been so caught up in the chase myself. Maybe it's time for me to slow down too." Tony smiled, feeling a sense of connection with Anne in that moment. It was a quiet moment of recognition, a shared understanding that the pressure of the past no longer had to define them. The weeks that followed were filled with small, meaningful experiences. Tony's work continued to grow, and while he had taken a step back to focus on his own well-being, the project's momentum did not wane. He began to understand that life didn't have to be either-or. It didn't have to be about pushing relentlessly forward or retreating completely. There was a middle ground, a space where he could continue to help others, but also take care of himself in the process. During this time, Tony met with his mentees regularly, offering guidance, sharing insights, and learning from their experiences. Each conversation reinforced the realization that healing and growth were not linear. Sometimes progress came in fits and starts. Sometimes it was about taking a few steps backward before moving forward again. But no matter the pace, the important thing was to keep moving. One afternoon, as Tony sat in a small cafe with his mentee Lien, he found himself reflecting on the nature of growth. Lien had been struggling with self-doubt, a feeling that she wasn't enough, no matter how much she accomplished. Tony had heard her story so many times, how she felt like she was always falling short of expectations. But today, something was different. Today, she seemed lighter. "Something's changed," Tony remarked, his voice soft but curious. Lien smiled shyly, her eyes glinting with a mixture of pride and relief. "I think I'm starting to believe I'm enough. I'm not perfect, but I'm enough, and that's okay." Tony felt a surge of pride for her, his heart swelling with a sense of fulfillment he hadn't expected. In helping others find their peace, he had found his own. The work wasn't always easy. It was often messy, often uncertain, but it was real, and it mattered. As the weeks turned into months, Tony's sense of purpose deepened. He had come to understand that peace wasn't something you achieved once and for all. It was something you nurtured, something you returned to over and over again. It was in the quiet moments of reflection, the stillness of the heart, the vulnerability of sharing your story with others. And it was in those moments that Tony knew, more than anything else, that he had found the true meaning of success. The balance Tony had worked so hard to achieve seemed to settle into place over time. Life no longer felt like a race, nor a series of unchecked boxes on a to-do list. There was a kind of tranquility in knowing that the journey ahead wouldn't be linear, that there would be setbacks and triumphs, all interwoven in a way that allowed for growth, but also rest. He had found peace not in the destination, but in the rhythm of simply moving forward at his own pace. One evening, as the city lights flickered like distant stars, Tony received a call from Mai. Her voice was laced with excitement, yet there was a hint of urgency that caught his attention immediately. "Tony, we need to meet," she said. "There's something I want to show you, something that could change everything." His curiosity piqued. Tony agreed to meet her at their usual cafe. As he sat down at the table, he could see the intensity in her eyes, the familiar fire that had driven her through every project they had worked on together. But today, there was a shift in her expression, something deeper. "I've been working on something," Mai began, her hands resting on the table as she leaned forward. "It's a proposal for an international conference on mental health focused on what we've been talking about, the importance of slowing down, of self-care, of mental peace, and I think you should be the one to present it." Tony's heart raced with the thought of taking on such a large-scale endeavor. He had already begun to step back from the demanding nature of his previous work, and now the idea of taking on a global platform felt like an enormous leap. "I'm flattered, but I'm not sure I'm ready for something like that," he replied, his voice uncertain. Mai smiled, her confidence unwavering. "Tony, you've been doing this work for years. You've been living this truth. Your message is exactly what the world needs to hear right now. People are craving authenticity, vulnerability, and real solutions to the pressures they face. You've always led with your heart. Now, it's time for the world to hear you." Her words hit home. It wasn't just about presenting a message. It was about sharing his story, the one that had come from so much personal struggle, from overcoming his own inner battles to find peace. If there was one thing he had learned, it was that healing and transformation could happen in the most unexpected places. Maybe this conference was one of those places. After a long pause, Tony looked at her, his mind racing with the possibilities. "Okay, I'll do it," he said quietly. Mai's face lit up with a genuine smile of relief. "I knew you'd say yes. We'll start preparing right away. This is going to be big." "Tony, the preparation for the conference was both exciting and daunting." Tony had never spoken to such a large audience before, let alone on a subject so close to his heart. He worked tirelessly, refining his message, crafting a speech that would not only resonate with the audience, but also challenge them to see mental health and self-care through a different lens. The days leading up to the event were filled with moments of doubt. Tony had never doubted his message, but the thought of standing before thousands of people, sharing his vulnerability, was a different challenge altogether. What if his words didn't reach them? What if they didn't understand? In the quiet hours of the night, Tony found himself returning to the same mantra. It wasn't about perfection. It was about connection. It was about opening himself up, not for the sake of being flawless, but for the sake of being real. If he could be honest and share his own struggles, perhaps others would feel empowered to do the same. The morning of the conference arrived, and the nerves that had built up inside him over the past few days were now an unmistakable presence. As Tony stood backstage, his heart pounded in his chest, each beat a reminder of the weight of the moment. But then he thought about everything that had led him here, the years of feeling lost, the search for peace, the journey toward healing, and he remembered the people whose lives he had touched, the stories of individuals who had found the courage through his work. They weren't just numbers or statistics, they were people, and his words could make a difference for them. With a deep breath, Tony stepped out onto the stage. The lights were bright, and the room felt vast. Yet, as he gazed out into the sea of faces, there was a profound sense of calm. This was his moment to be vulnerable, to share the truth he had come to know so deeply. The audience fell silent as Tony began to speak. His voice wavered at first, but as he spoke from the heart, the words began to flow more naturally. He shared his personal journey, the struggles he had faced, the way his ambition had once driven him to the brink, and the process of learning how to slow down, to take care of himself, to reconnect with his values. "I've learned," Tony said, "that peace isn't something you find by running faster. It's something you find by pausing, by being present with yourself, with your emotions, with your truth. It's okay to not have all the answers. It's okay to not be perfect. The journey is about finding balance, about embracing your vulnerability and knowing that it's enough." The room was still, the words hanging in the air. Tony felt the weight of the silence, unsure of how his message was being received. But then, as if by cue, a single clap broke the stillness, followed by another, until the entire room erupted into applause. The recognition wasn't for his success, nor for his polished delivery. It was for the raw honesty he had shared, for the courage to speak his truth in a world that often demands perfection. As the applause rang in his ears, Tony felt a deep sense of peace settle over him. This was the moment he had been waiting for, not just as a speaker, but as a person who had embraced the fullness of his own humanity. The journey ahead was still unknown, but one thing was certain: Tony had found his true calling. It wasn't about being the best, it was about being real. And in that, he had found a deeper success than any accolade could provide. The conference had left Tony feeling lighter, more alive than he had in years. He had shared his story with so many people, and the response had been overwhelmingly positive. The energy that had radiated from the crowd after his speech was contagious, and he felt a renewed sense of purpose, the feeling of being understood, of connecting with others who had walked similar paths, was indescribable. But even in the afterglow of such a profound experience, a part of him couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. He'd always been someone who believed in the power of growth, of pushing forward. But now, he questioned if he had truly reached the depth of his own journey. He had spoken of peace and balance, But had he really found it? Was he truly at peace with himself? Or was he still chasing something just out of reach? Over the next few weeks, Tony spent time reflecting. He no longer felt the weight of the world pressing down on him the way it once had. But there was a quiet discontent that lingered, like a soft hum in the background of his life. Mai had been watching him closely during these weeks, sensing the restlessness that had taken root in him. One afternoon, she asked him out for a walk by the river, knowing that it was the place where Tony often went when he needed to clear his mind. "Something's off, isn't it?" she said, her voice gentle but knowing. "I can see it in your eyes. You've done so much work, Tony, but you're still looking for something. What is it?" Tony stopped walking and gazed out at the river, the water glistening in the late afternoon sun. The sight was calming, but his mind felt unsettled, like the current beneath the surface. "I don't know," he said, his voice tinged with frustration. "I've talked about peace. I've shared my story. I've helped others. But there's still this feeling inside me that I'm not done, that I'm missing something. I don't know what it is, but it's there." Mai looked at him thoughtfully, then placed a hand on his shoulder. "Maybe you've been chasing peace the way you used to chase success," she said quietly. "Maybe it's not something to be attained. Maybe it's something to be accepted. You've spent so much time seeking answers, Tony, that you've forgotten to live in the present moment." Her words hit him like a bolt of lightning. He had been so focused on fixing himself, on finding that elusive moment of complete peace, that he had neglected to simply be with where he was in life. He had been so intent on the destination that he hadn't allowed himself to enjoy the journey, the process of being present and embracing the beauty in the here and now. "Maybe you're right," Tony admitted. "I've been running from one thing to the next, always searching for the next piece of the puzzle. But maybe the puzzle is complete just as it is." The next few days passed in a haze of clarity. Tony began to spend less time analyzing his thoughts and more time experiencing his surroundings. He went back to his routine, but this time with a different perspective, one that allowed him to fully immerse himself in the moments that had once seemed insignificant. He spent time with family, enjoying their laughter and conversations without the pressure of rushing off to the next task. He took long walks by the river, watching the changing sky and listening to the rustling leaves, allowing himself to simply be. It was in these small moments of stillness that Tony began to feel a sense of peace that wasn't tied to any external goal. He didn't need to be constantly achieving, constantly moving forward. He realized that peace wasn't about the absence of struggle. It was about accepting it, about finding contentment in the face of uncertainty. One evening, as he sat on the balcony of his apartment, watching the city lights flicker below, Tony felt a deep sense of gratitude for the journey he had been on. It hadn't been easy, and there were still moments of doubt, but he had come to understand something fundamental about himself. He didn't need to have all the answers. He didn't need to be perfect. He simply needed to be. His phone buzzed, snapping him out of his reverie. It was a message from Mai. "You've done it, Tony. You found your peace." He smiled, his heart full. For the first time in a long while, he felt truly present, truly at peace with the journey he had taken, There would still be challenges, still be moments of doubt, but he had come to understand that peace was not something to be earned. It was something to be embraced in its imperfect, beautiful form. As he sat back in his chair, watching the night unfold around him, Tony realized that he had found the one thing he had been seeking all along. Not a destination, but a way of being. And that was enough. The next few weeks were transformative. Tony had found a new sense of balance, but the deeper he dug into his own reflections, the more he realized that peace was not a static state. It was fluid. Sometimes it would rush in like a wave, and other times it would retreat, leaving him to navigate the ebb and flow of life. But one thing was clear. He no longer felt the pressure to fix himself, to chase after something intangible. He had started to embrace the messiness of life, and in doing so, he found freedom. Mai noticed the change in him too. There was a lightness in his step, a quiet confidence that hadn't been there before. She was proud of him, but she also saw that there was more work to be done, a deeper layer of healing that had yet to be addressed. One evening, over dinner, she looked at him with an intensity that caught his attention. "Tony," she began slowly, "you've done so much work on your own journey, but what about the people who've been with you all along? What about the ones who need your help now?" Tony paused, fork halfway to his mouth. He hadn't really considered that aspect of his growth, the fact that his journey wasn't just about him. It was about the people around him too. His family, his friends, the community he had been a part of for so long. He had been so focused on his own healing that he had overlooked the fact that others were still grappling with their own struggles, perhaps in silence. "Mash, I don't know what you mean," he said quietly, the words not fully forming in his mind. "You've spent so much time talking about your own peace and what it means to find balance," Mai said, her voice soft but firm. "But peace isn't just something you keep to yourself. It's something you share. You've built a foundation for yourself, but now it's time to extend that to others, to be the bridge that helps others find their way." Her words hit him hard, like a call to action he couldn't ignore. He had always been someone who believed in helping others, but in his quest for inner peace, he had forgotten that true peace wasn't just about him. It was about creating ripples, about passing on the lessons he had learned. That night, after dinner, Tony sat alone in his apartment, his thoughts a whirlwind. He realized that his journey had only just begun. He had learned to heal himself, but he still had so much to offer to the world. He could be the guide for others, just as others had been a guide for him. He could help people find their own peace, not by giving them answers, but by sharing his story, by offering them the tools he had learned to use. The next day, he reached out to his old mentor, the one who had first inspired him to embark on this journey of self-discovery. The mentor, a wise woman named Lan, had always encouraged him to take his wisdom and use it to uplift others. "Tony, you've always had the ability to inspire," Lan had told him during one of their early conversations, "but you mustn't hold on to that inspiration for yourself. You need to share it. Pass it on. The world needs it." That was the catalyst. That was when Tony knew he had to step into a new role. He had to be a leader, not in the sense of being in charge, but in the sense of being a guide, a helper, a light in the dark for others who were lost. Over the next few months, Tony began to volunteer his time at community centers, holding workshops and group discussions. He shared his story openly, not just the victories, but the struggles, the doubts, the moments when he had wanted to give up. He talked about the steps he had taken to find peace and balance. But more importantly, he listened to the people in the room. He listened to their stories, their struggles, their dreams. It wasn't always easy. There were moments of doubt, moments when he felt like he was failing or not making enough of a difference. But each time someone came up to him after a session to thank him, to share how his words had helped them see things in a new light, he knew that he was on the right path. One particular moment stood out to him. It was a Saturday afternoon, and he was leading a group session about overcoming fear. A woman, perhaps in her early 30s, stood up during the Q&A portion, her eyes full of emotion. "I've been holding on to this fear for so long," she said, her voice trembling. Fear of failure, fear of never being good enough. And hearing you talk about your journey, about how you found peace, it's the first time I've ever thought that maybe I could change. Maybe I don't have to be afraid anymore. Tony looked at her, his heart full. This was why he did it. This was why he had stepped up and started sharing his story. For moments like this, when someone else found the courage to let go of their fear, to take that first step toward their own healing. In the following weeks, more people came forward, eager to find their own path to peace. Tony found himself in a position of leadership that he hadn't anticipated, but one that felt right. He was no longer just a speaker or a participant in his own healing journey. He was a guide, a mentor, someone who could show others that peace wasn't a distant goal to be reached. It was something that could be found right here, right now. In the way we live our lives. But as Tony continued his work with others, he realized something profound. The more he helped others find peace, the more peace he found within himself. It wasn't a one-time achievement. It was an ongoing, ever-evolving process. And in this shared experience of healing, Tony found a deep, unshakable connection to the world around him. As time passed, Tony's work in the community grew. He found himself teaching not just individuals, but entire groups of people, organizations, and even corporations. His message was simple. Peace is not something you find in a place or a person. It is something you create within yourself and, by extension, in the spaces you occupy. His success wasn't measured by the number of people he reached, but by the depth of their transformation. There were moments when he would receive heartfelt messages from people he had helped, messages that confirmed that his work mattered. But even more telling were the moments in the group sessions when someone who had struggled with deep anxiety or pain could smile, knowing that their own journey to peace had begun. One such instance occurred during a workshop on mindfulness. A man in his late 40s, named Min, had struggled with anger management for years. He had come to the workshop reluctantly, having been pushed by his wife, who had seen how his anger was affecting their relationship. Min was reserved at first, his arms crossed, his jaw clenched. But as Tony guided the group through breathing exercises and meditation practices, Min's demeanor slowly shifted. His clenched fists relaxed, and his shoulders loosened. At the end of the session, Min stayed behind as the group dispersed, his eyes a little brighter than they had been when he first walked in. "Thank you," Min said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what happened, but I feel different, like something inside me has been unlocked. I'm going to try this at home. I want to change for my family." That was the moment Tony truly understood the power of the work he was doing. It wasn't about grand gestures or making a huge impact overnight. It was about the small, quiet transformations that rippled outward. It was about the subtle changes in a person's heart that slowly shifted the world around them. But Tony wasn't blind to the challenges. There were times when he felt overwhelmed. There were moments when the pressure to always be the calm, wise one was exhausting. He was human after all, and sometimes the weight of being a guide for others took its toll. He had moments of self-doubt, moments when he questioned whether he was doing enough or whether he was truly equipped to help the people who came to him for guidance. It was during one of these moments of self-doubt that Mai, ever perceptive, noticed something was off. "Tony," she said one evening, as they sat on the balcony overlooking the city, "I can tell something's bothering you. You've been quieter than usual. What's going on?" Tony sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's just, sometimes I wonder if I'm doing enough. The people who come to me for help, they're putting so much trust in me, and I can't always give them the answers they need. It's frustrating. I want to be the person who can solve everything, but I know I can't. And that scares me." Mai reached across the table, gently touching his hand. "You're doing exactly what you're supposed to. You're giving them the tools to help themselves, not solving their problems for them. That's the difference. And sometimes, just listening, being there for someone, that's enough." Her words were a reminder of the simplicity of it all. Tony didn't have to have all the answers. In fact, the most profound help he could offer was creating a space where others could discover their own solutions. He wasn't a savior, he was a guide, and that distinction, subtle as it was, made all the difference in how he approached his work and his own peace. In the months that followed, Tony became more at ease with his role. He had accepted that he wasn't perfect, that he didn't have all the answers, and that was okay. His work wasn't about offering solutions to every problem. It was about being present, being a steady hand in moments of uncertainty, and allowing others to find their own path. And yet, despite the peace he had found, there was still one final step Tony hadn't yet addressed. He had spent so much time helping others, so much time reflecting on his past, that he hadn't fully healed the wounds within himself, particularly when it came to his family. One afternoon, he decided to visit his parents, whom he hadn't seen in several months. It was a visit long overdue, one he had been avoiding. His relationship with his parents had always been complicated. Their love for him was clear, but their expectations and cultural pressures had often felt suffocating. Tony had carried the weight of their expectations for years, unsure of how to navigate the gap between their values and his own. As he sat in the living room, the same room where he had spent his childhood, he felt a mixture of nostalgia and discomfort. His parents looked older, their faces lined with age and worry, but their eyes still held the same warmth they had always had. "Son, it's good to see you," his father said, his voice rough with emotion. "We've missed you." Tony smiled, though it felt strained. "I've missed you too, Dad." The conversation flowed, but there was an unspoken tension in the room. Tony had come with the intention of clearing the air, of finally confronting the past, but the words didn't come easily. He was afraid of what might happen if he expressed the hurt he had carried for so long. Finally, after dinner, as they sat together, Tony spoke up. "Mom, Dad, I've been thinking a lot lately about us, about everything." His parents looked at him, their eyes attentive, waiting for him to continue. Tony felt a lump in his throat but pressed on. "I love you both, but I've realized that I've been holding on to a lot of resentment. I've been living my life based on expectations that weren't mine, and it's been harsh, feeling like I can't live the way I want to." His parents exchanged glances, and his mother, ever gentle, placed a hand on his. "We never wanted to make you feel trapped, Tony. We only wanted what was best for you." Tony nodded, tears threatening to spill from his eyes. "I know, but it still hurt, and I need you to know that I'm doing things for me now. I'm not angry anymore. I just need you to understand." It wasn't a perfect conversation, and it wasn't a resolution, but it was a start. It was the beginning of healing old wounds, of moving forward as a family. It was the first step in Tony fully accepting himself and finding peace with his past. In the end, peace wasn't about perfection. It wasn't about fixing everything or having all the answers. It was about the willingness to face the difficult truths, to sit with the discomfort, and to find freedom in the journey itself. The days that followed his conversation with his parents were filled with reflection. Tony had found a sense of release that he hadn't expected. He had been holding his family's expectations in a tightly wound knot inside himself for years, and finally, allowing those feelings to surface and be acknowledged had lightened the burden. But even with that step forward, Tony knew that peace wasn't something that could be fixed in one moment. No matter how significant, there were still moments when the past would come back to haunt him, when his own doubts would rear their head. But now, he had tools to deal with them. Tools he had spent years cultivating in himself and sharing with others. He resumed his work with even more vigor. His workshops were growing in number, and the people who came to him were finding what they needed, whether they realized it or not. There was one session that stood out in particular, one that Tony would remember as a turning point in his journey. It was a session on forgiveness. Tony had always been careful about how he framed the concept of forgiveness. He knew that forgiveness didn't mean forgetting or excusing someone's behavior. It was about releasing the hold that the offense had on you, about freeing yourself from the emotional weight of the past. But he also knew that forgiveness couldn't be rushed. It was a process, a difficult, painful process at times. The session was held in a small, intimate room. About 10 people attended, each with their own reasons for seeking forgiveness. Some sought it for themselves, others for those who had hurt them. Tony felt a weight in the room as he opened the session, a palpable tension. We often think of forgiveness as a gift we give to others, he began, his voice soft but steady. But the truth is, forgiveness is a gift we give ourselves. It frees us from the chains of the past, from the anger, resentment, and hurt that we carry. But it is not something you can force. You must be willing to let go, not for them, but for you. As he spoke, he saw the way the people in the room were reacting. Some nodded, while others looked away, clearly struggling with the idea. Tony paused, allowing the silence to settle over them. I want you to think of someone in your life, someone who has hurt you, who has wronged you. Visualize them in your mind. See them clearly, and then imagine that you are holding a weight in your hands. That weight is the anger, the pain, the resentment you feel because of what they did. Hold it in your hands. Feel the heaviness. Tony led them through a guided meditation, encouraging them to release the weight they had been carrying for so long. As they did, he could feel the collective tension in the room begin to soften. After the session, one woman, who approached him. She had been quiet throughout the entire workshop, her face etched with sorrow. She had lost her son in a tragic accident, and her grief was palpable. Her pain was something that Tony could feel in his chest. But when she spoke to him, it wasn't just about her loss. "Thank you for today," Tu said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've been carrying my son's death as a weight for years. It's like it's all I can think about. But now, for the first time, I think I understand what you mean. I've been angry at the world, at fate, at everything, but I've never really allowed myself to forgive." Tony nodded gently, his heart aching for her. Forgiveness is a journey. Two, it's not something you do once and forget. It's a continual process, and some days will be harder than others. But even the smallest step toward letting go can bring peace. Thu gave him a small smile, tears welling in her eyes. "I'm gonna try. I have to." The encounter was a reminder for Tony that while he was helping others, he was also constantly helping himself. The act of guiding others toward healing was a way of deepening his own understanding of peace and forgiveness. Every session, every person he helped, brought him closer to his own truth. In the weeks that followed, Tony's own practice deepened. He began to explore new ways to nourish his soul, reading books on spirituality, seeking counsel from those who had walked the path before him, and spending more time in nature. He knew that peace was a continuous practice, one that required ongoing care and attention. But it wasn't all peaceful. He still faced moments of doubt, moments when the pressures of his work, his family, and his own expectations threatened to overwhelm him. He still had nights when sleep eluded him, when the quietness of the world around him seemed too much to bear. It was on one of those nights, when his mind was racing, that Tony received a message from Mai. "Are you up?" It read. Tony smiled at the message. Mai always knew when he was struggling, even from a distance. She had an intuition that seemed to see through the veneer of calm he had so carefully constructed. He quickly typed back, "Yeah, can't sleep. A lot on my mind." Mai's response was almost immediate. "I'm coming over. You need to talk." Tony's heart warmed at the thought. It was moments like these that made him realize just how much he had changed, how much he had grown. Years ago, he would have dealt with his struggles alone, buried them deep inside. But now, he understood that peace was not just a solitary journey. It was one that could be shared, that could be nurtured with the support of others. Mai arrived a few minutes later, bringing with her a small basket of food and a quiet smile. They sat together in silence for a while, the comfort of each other's presence enough to ease the tension in Tony's chest. Finally, Mai spoke. "You don't have to carry everything alone. You know, you've been helping people for so long, but you're allowed to lean on someone too." Tony let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "I know, I just sometimes feel like I have to be the one who has all the answers. But I'm not perfect. None of us are," Mai said softly. "But that's what makes you real, Tony. That's what makes you human. And that's why people trust you. You're not just giving them answers. You're showing them that it's okay to be vulnerable, that it's okay to not have everything figured out." Her words, simple as they were, settled into Tony's heart like a balm. He didn't need to be perfect. He just needed to keep showing up for himself and for others. The night ended quietly, with Mai leaving just before dawn. As Tony sat in the soft light of the early morning, he felt a deep sense of calm wash over him. He had come so far, and while he knew there would be challenges ahead, he was no longer afraid of them. He had the tools, the support, and the inner peace to navigate whatever came next. For the first time in a long time, Tony felt ready to embrace the future with all its uncertainties and joys. Peace wasn't just a destination, it was a way of living, of showing up each day with intention and presence. And as he watched the sun rise, painting the sky with hues of pink and gold, Tony realized that this was his journey, his path to peace. The weeks that followed were marked by a sense of stillness that Tony had never known before. For someone who had spent most of his life constantly on the move, chasing answers, providing solutions, solving problems, this feeling of calm was almost foreign, but it was also deeply nourishing. He had come to realize that peace, true peace, wasn't something that could be hurried or manufactured. It was something that had to be allowed to unfold naturally, a process that could not be forced. Tony's work continued. Of course, the workshops grew more popular, his sessions more impactful. People were showing up, not just for the advice, but for the sense of presence that Tony had cultivated within himself. His ability to be with them, truly with them, was what made his work different. It wasn't about offering quick fixes or simplistic answers. It was about providing a space where people could feel heard, seen, and understood. One afternoon, as he was preparing for a new workshop on self-compassion, Tony received a call that would mark another turning point in his journey. It was from his mother, Kona. His mother's voice came through, soft and tentative. "I need to talk to you." Tony sat down, feeling a strange mix of apprehension and curiosity. His relationship with his parents had evolved, but there were still moments when old patterns would resurface, moments when he felt like he was still trying to gain their approval, still carrying the weight of their expectations. "Of course, Mom, what's on your mind?" Tony asked, trying to sound as calm as possible. "I've been thinking about our conversation, about what you said." His mother began, her voice halting. as though she was choosing her words carefully. And I realize I've been hard on you. I never truly understood what you've been carrying all these years. The pressure I put on you, the expectations. I'm sorry, Tony. I never meant for it to hurt you. I thought I was doing what was best. Tony's heart tightened. This was the last thing he had expected to hear. His mother, the woman who had spent so many years pushing him to be more, to do more, was apologizing. It was a moment that felt surreal, like the kind of breakthrough you read about in books, but never thought would happen to you. I'm not blaming you, Mom, Tony replied, his voice thick with emotion. I needed to find my own way, and I did. It's not easy, but I've learned to live with it, to make peace with it. There was a long silence on the other end of the line, and for a moment, Tony wondered if the conversation had ended. Then his mother spoke again, this time more softly, with the kind of vulnerability that Tony had rarely heard from her. I know, my son, and I'm proud of you. I know it hasn't been easy, but I see you now. I see who you've become. Tony swallowed hard, the weight of his mother's words sinking in. Thank you, Mom. That means everything to me. For a moment, they both sat in silence, the connection between them different than it had ever been before. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't without its complications, but it was real. The conversation ended with a quiet promise to keep in touch more, to continue healing in their own ways, but this time as equals. No more expectations or pressures, just the simple understanding that they were both on their own journeys. The next few weeks were marked by a sense of deepening gratitude. Tony found himself more present with his work, more able to listen to the needs of others without getting lost in his own. He still had his moments of doubt, his moments of fear, but they no longer consumed him. He had learned how to navigate them, how to let them pass like waves in the ocean. Then, one evening, Mai called. It was a bit of a surprise. The last time they had spoken, things had been more casual, comfortable. This time, however, there was something in her voice that made Tony pause. Hey, I was wondering if you'd be interested in something different. I've been working on a new project, and I think you'd be perfect for it. Tony raised an eyebrow. Mai was always coming up with new ideas, but this one seemed to have a different energy about it. What kind of project? He asked. Curious. I've been thinking about creating a space, not just a workshop, but a community, a place where people can come together, share their stories, and learn from each other. I know you've been doing this work with individuals, but what if we could bring it into a group, a support system? What do you think? Tony felt a surge of excitement at the idea. This wasn't just another workshop or a series of sessions. It was an opportunity to build something deeper, something that could grow into a true community of healing and support. It felt like the next natural step for both of them. I think it's a great idea, Tony said, after a moment of contemplation. But what would it look like? We'll have to figure that out together, Mai replied with a laugh. But I think it's time for something bigger, something that doesn't just help individuals, but helps them come together to build relationships, share experiences, and ultimately heal. The idea planted itself in Tony's mind, and over the next few days, it began to take shape. He could see the potential of it, a space where people weren't just attending workshops, but creating a lasting impact on each other's lives. They could form a real community, one that transcended traditional therapy or coaching. It could be a sanctuary, a safe space for anyone who was ready to embrace their journey of healing. Mai and Tony began to brainstorm ideas, eventually coming up with a name for the project: the Healing Circle. It would be a place for people to gather, share their stories, and work together toward healing. It wasn't just about individual growth, it was about collective growth, mutual support, and understanding. Over time, the Healing Circle gained momentum. People started signing up, not just for workshops, but for something deeper. The energy was palpable, and Tony felt the rush of excitement that came from knowing they were building something meaningful. This was the culmination of everything he had worked for, everything he had learned in his journey. This was his next step. And as he watched the first group of people gather for their first meeting, Tony felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: peace. A deep, unshakable peace that came from knowing he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The Healing Circle wasn't just a project, it was a part of his journey, and he knew, deep down, that it was just the beginning. The Healing Circle was born in the most unassuming way. No grand announcement, no elaborate opening ceremony, just a small group of people gathered in a room, uncertain of what they were about to embark on, but eager to find something new. For Tony, it felt like a new chapter, one that brought with it both excitement and a sense of responsibility he hadn't fully expected. The first meeting was simple. Mai and Tony welcomed the group, introducing themselves and explaining the vision behind the Healing Circle, a space for mutual support, where every voice mattered and no one was ever alone in their struggles. The idea of community, of collective healing, was a theme that resonated deeply with everyone in the room. It was raw, genuine, and connected. I know this might feel a little strange at first, Tony began, his voice calm, yet with an underlying warmth that put everyone at ease. But this is a space where you can just be, where you don't have to have all the answers, where you don't need to be perfect. We're here because we know that together we are stronger. The group nodded in understanding, each person silently acknowledging the unique journey they were on. The diverse mix of people, from young professionals to older individuals, created an interesting dynamic. Some were looking for help in processing grief, others in navigating transitions, and a few simply wanted to be a part of something larger than themselves. There was no judgment, no preconceived notion of what the Healing Circle should look like. It was a blank canvas, and together they would paint it. Tony and Mai had planned an interactive icebreaker activity to start things off. It was designed to help people share something meaningful about their lives without feeling pressured. The goal wasn't to dive into deep emotions right away, but to establish a foundation of trust. Let's start with something simple, Mai suggested. If you could describe your journey in one word, what would it be? There was a quiet moment as everyone thought about the question. Then, one by one, people began to share. Awakening. One woman said softly, her voice carrying a depth of meaning that made Tony pause, overwhelmed. Another man spoke, his eyes downcast, hopeful said a younger woman, her voice filled with optimism despite the uncertainty in her expression. Tony noticed the way everyone's shoulders seemed to relax a little as the answers came. In that room, there was no pressure to perform or to act like everything was okay. They were simply acknowledging where they were at the moment. It was a powerful shift from the facades people often put up in the outside world. As the meeting continued, there was a natural flow to the conversation. Tony noticed how the group began to share stories with each other, small fragments of their lives. The vulnerability that had initially felt daunting was now met with compassion, and there was a tangible sense of connection forming between the individuals in the room. The next few weeks saw the group evolve. More people joined the healing circle, each bringing their own experiences, their own stories, and their own struggles. Tony began to see the power of what he and Mai had started. This wasn't just about them anymore. It was about the collective strength of the community that was slowly being built. They met regularly, sometimes weekly, other times bi-weekly, depending on the needs of the group. The healing circle became a lifeline for many, and Tony found himself growing alongside them, learning as much from them as they learned from him. He realized that healing wasn't just about the individual. It was about the relationships we form, the support we offer, and the way we show up for each other in our most vulnerable moments. Tony's personal journey, however, was not without its challenges. As he dedicated himself more fully to the healing circle, he began to notice that his own doubts and insecurities would surface, especially when it came to his role as a leader. There were days when the weight of holding space for so many people felt overwhelming. At times, he questioned his ability to be enough for them, enough to guide them, to help them find what they needed. But with each challenge came growth. Tony learned to lean into his own vulnerability, to acknowledge that he, too, was a part of this healing process. He didn't have to have all the answers. What mattered was showing up with an open heart, being willing to learn and grow alongside the people who trusted him with their stories. One evening, as Tony was preparing for another group session, he received a message that would further challenge his understanding of what it meant to lead and to heal. It was from his mother. Tony had not heard from her in a while. After their last conversation, he had expected things to settle into a new rhythm. His mother had apologized, and they had both made promises to continue building a more genuine relationship. But he had no idea that the message she had sent would shake him to his core. Kona, I've been thinking. It started. I know I've made mistakes in the past, and I've hurt you in ways that I can't undo. But I want to try, really try, to do better. I need you to know that I'm not just apologizing for the past. I'm apologizing for the future, for the ways I may continue to fall short. But I want you to know that I'm here and I'm willing to do the work. Tony sat back, reading the words over and over again. His heart pounded in his chest. His mother's admission, the willingness to change, to show up for him in a way she never had before, felt like both a gift and a challenge. He knew that healing was a process, one that didn't have a set timeline or formula. But this was a moment he had never expected to happen. It was a moment that he knew would change everything. Tony replied simply, I'm here. Mom, we can take this one step at a time. And so they did. With time, patience, and a lot of hard conversations, Tony and his mother began to rebuild their relationship. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments of tension, moments when old patterns resurfaced. But Tony realized that healing wasn't about perfection, it was about progress. As the healing circle grew and flourished, Tony knew that he was living a life aligned with his truest purpose. It wasn't a life free of challenges, but it was a life filled with meaning, connection, and the courage to keep showing up both for himself and for others. And for the first time in his life, Tony was no longer searching for a destination. He had arrived. This was his journey, and it was exactly as it was meant to be.